Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just probably not exactly how you would expect from our title. My name is Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And today we have a very special guest that we have brought to you today to talk about rejecting nationalization and embracing local news, Sean Ewing, who is a fifth-year PhD candidate at UCLA and incoming assistant professor at Florida Gulf Coast University. Sean is an expert on local news and sort of all of the things that attend it thereof. So Sean, why don't you give us a little bit more about yourself? Who are you? What do you do? Why have we brought you on the show today?
Sure. So for my dissertation in my doctoral studies at UCLA, I've looked at the decline of local news and in particular how the changing media ecosystem generally has affected Americans, the way we get information, and in particular the way we engage with local politics, given that a lot of this is about the decline of local news. And so I think why I'm here today is to talk about that and to tell you about why that matters and what maybe we lose when local news goes away and hopefully what we can gain when we restore it to its former glory.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to conceptualize like what we're after in this episode here. I think one of the key things that I am interested in, and that I know hopefully our audience will be interested in, is how exactly did we get here, basically? We've seen this sort of long-term secular decline in local news, but I feel like you ask a dozen different people and you get sort of a dozen different stories about why exactly that's happened, right? So in your research and both your independent research and your sort of review of the literature here, how did we get to this point where it seems like most news is nationally focused and people know less and less about the local happenings, the local goings on?
Yeah, well, I think to think about, how local news has declined and how nationalization has risen, it helps to go back to a time where local newspapers were profitable and were kind of the dominant way that people got information. And you don't have to go back that far, back to the early 90s or even the late 90s, even the early 2000s. Local newspapers were doing quite well financially. There were many of them in the country. And, when you think about the type of competition that local news had at that time, it really was like radio news and TV news. And while those mediums certainly introduced competition for daily newspapers, there were some limitations too. Both radio and TV, you had to tune in right when it was on. You didn't necessarily have a choice in what they were going to talk about. So if you were only interested in one topic, you maybe couldn't choose that. And you couldn't pause it, right? So if you needed to go to the bathroom or somewhere else, you were going to miss some news. And I think because of those reasons, local news and newspapers were still kind of preferred, and a lot of people still subscribed to them. But in the late 90s and the early 2000s, some things started changing. And I think there's a couple changes that are important. I think the first one is sort of the rise in partisan media. I think a lot of people forget that prior to the 1980s, partisan media wasn't even allowed to exist. There were literally FCC rules that said you can't have content that's slanted to a particular issue or for a particular side of an issue. And that meant that partisan media just didn't exist. And when the FCC eliminated that rule in the late 1980s, that allowed for the flourishing of Fox News and MSNBC, and then later on, conservative talk radio, and then of course today's ecosystem like Hassan on Twitch and TikTok and all other places, where people get ideologically slanted news. And the introduction of that meant that newspapers had to compete not just with a different medium of news, but also a whole different way that news is presented, right? And it's presented in a way that's more entertaining, in a way that preconforms with things that viewers already believe. And I think that type of content, a lot of people wanted that. And that meant that there was just going to be more competition for newspapers. And I think that sort of started some of the decline.
And we do have, I think, research on whether the slant of news is demand driven, right? Like people want news that agrees with their ideological priors, and so that news is provided to people, much like markets tend to provide other things to people. How true do you think that version of events is? Because that's sort of the version of events I'm familiar with from the limited stuff that we do on news in sort of the core sequence of American politics courses and all.
Yeah, I would say that demand is a big part of it. I mean, I think like the interesting thing about demand is some people ask me, has demand changed, right? Is it just the case that people used to really want local news and they don't anymore? I don't think that's it. I don't think it's that demand for local news has changed considerably. I think what's happened instead is that more news outlets have emerged to fill the demand that already existed. And those outlets just didn't exist in the past because either wasn't the technology to make them available to people, or there were FCC rules in place to prevent that type of content from being produced. And so I think as partisan media and the internet and social media all give Americans different ways to get information about politics, that means that the people that maybe were reluctant subscribers to local newspapers who wanted information but maybe didn't want it quite in that way are not going to subscribe to local newspapers anymore, and they're instead going to go to these other places that they can get information in a way that better suits their preferences. Now I think there's always going to be some people that want local news, but that's maybe a smaller number.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that people switch from not consuming local news at all to partisan national media, or from is there a development of like a more partisan local media as kind of an interim state as they nationalize their media consumption? Is that something we know about?
It's a great question. And like the funny thing about partisanship of newspapers is that actually was the model at the very founding of the country.
Right?
Newspapers were explicitly partisan in the founding, and that kind of went away in the 1800s when mass literacy started and more people were reading newspapers, and newspapers wanted to make money off advertising, and so they didn't want to, turn off half their audience by giving them ideologically slanted news. In terms of what's going on today, I don't think there's a whole lot of explicit ideological slant in daily newspapers. I think a lot of them still pertain to be relatively content neutral as much as they can, especially when compared to national newspapers. I do think we are starting to see emergence of things like pink slime journalism, which is the type of journalism that masquerades as local news, but maybe isn't really and is more ideologically slanted type of things. And so I think there is. I don't think local newspapers themselves have become very partisan or more ideologically slanted than the past, but I think more things have sort of infected that ecosystem that pretend to be local news but maybe aren't.
And when we talk about the ecosystem, we also think about sort of, to take us maybe off of newspapers specifically, there's also like local TV stations, there's more local radio stations. I know your main focus is on newspapers, but based on sort of like what you know about how they relate to the broader information ecosystem, how does this play in with like the consolidation of media generally, right? You hear about like, I can't remember their name, like Courier or someone buying all of the like local TV stations. Sinclair, there we go. I was close enough. It's the same similar sound.
Yeah.
Sinclair buying up broadcast stations, like private equity firms buying up local newspapers. How much of this story of the decline of local news and the increasing nationalization of coverage, like even within local periodicals, local outlets, is driven by those ownership changes, as opposed to other things that might be out there, sort of in the ether, in the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think my research in particular has looked at investment firms buying newspapers, so I'll speak more to that, but I could talk a little bit about the TV stations too. When investment firms started buying newspapers in the late 90s and the 2000s and continuing on to the present, there's been a lot of public outcry against this. People have said, this is awful. They're destroying newspapers. There's actually literally a book written called How Private Equity Destroyed American Newspapers and Undermined Democracy. Like, that's the title of the book. So I think like that,
very
suggests,
clear.
Yeah, tell us how you really feel.
And so I think, there's that perception out there that these owners are these owners are driving the central changes of the decline of local news. I don't think that quite matches up with what my research and other people's research has found, which is maybe a more nuanced picture. And I think it is true that outlets owned by investment firms, and then thinking about Sinclair, which isn't quite an investment firm, they are a media-focused organization, but they have some ideological goals that aren't maybe consistent with normal local news. That those firms do reduce local political coverage, and then subsequently people know less about local politics and then engage less with local politics. And I think all that is true and is bad, but it's in a pretty small magnitude of effect. It's about a 10% decline is what I find in my paper in terms of local political coverage when an investment firm buys a paper. And that's not the kind of drastic death of a newspaper that I think some outsiders would claim. And so I think what that suggests to me is more of a nuanced picture. And I think furthermore, we obviously don't know what would have happened to these newspapers if they hadn't been bought by an investment firm.
Right.
But it's entirely, it's not like there were hundreds of prospective buyers tripping over themselves to buy a dying newspaper, right? Like in some cases, the investment firm was the only potential buyer, and maybe that owner, if there was no investment firm to buy their newspaper, would have just shuttered it down entirely and it would have closed. And so I think there's a world in which investment owners have helped save newspapers, and I think maybe the things that they're doing to try and make the newspapers more profitable are maybe just the costs that we pay. But so I think it's nuanced, right? There's reasons to believe it could be bad, but I think it's certainly not doesn't match the public outcry, and I think there's reasons to suspect it could be helping as well.
And to your point about there not really being a observable counterfactual in that situation, you see that there may be kind of a death spiral going on once the local newspaper becomes less profitable, whether it's a corporate owner or a legacy owner whose family has owned the newspaper for generations, etc. They're going to be doing some of the same things, which include, cutting staff, covering fewer events, that sort of thing. So the quality of the news gathering goes down. So people are less invested in it. It's harder to make money. So the quality goes down, et cetera, et cetera. So you could see how you would wind up in a death spiral no matter who owns the paper, if you're not coming up with another way to increase circulation or regain profitability in some other way.
Yeah. And on the point of profitability, we sort of alluded to the idea of competition being much more direct towards local newspapers and local news than it had been even just 20, 25, 30 years ago. But what do you think, just based on your understanding of this research and this literature, are sort of like the key drivers of that decline in profitability? Is it the internet really eating into classifieds? Is it social media advertising specifically taking over this kind of thing? Where do you see most of the decline in the profitability of these local outlets coming from?
I think fragmentation is probably the one word I would say is kind of the answer, which is that there's just so many media sources today. And I think it's not just that there's a large number of media sources, but there's also just so many different types, right, that give you varying degrees of entertainment or partisan slanted news, or, all other kinds of things that Americans might prefer, things that, 15-second news clip, a guy playing a video game while talking about the news, right? Like, so there's all different these ways to get information. And I think some of those are going to appeal to niche audiences. Some of those are going to appeal to bigger audiences. But I think what local newspapers are finding is that increasingly the people that are still subscribed to local newspapers are the ones that really care about local news, that care about local politics, and want to be engaged. And I think some of those people are always going to exist, right? There's always going to be some demand for local news and some people that want local politics. But I think what newspapers are finding is that those large numbers of subscribers that they enjoyed in 20 years ago, that those people were reluctant subscribers, right? The way that newspapers transmit information, that was not their first choice. And I think now that those first choices are available to them, they are not subscribing anymore. And that just means newspapers, one, are making less money off circulation, right? They just have fewer subscribers. But also, two, advertising, which has long been the primary source of revenue for newspapers, that's just dropped a huge amount. Newspapers made about $50 billion in advertising in 2004, and today that number is less than $10 billion. So that's just, massive drop in revenue. And that means that obviously, I think that really is the big explanation as to why there's such a decline.
So Megan and I sort of talked a little bit about this last week in our episode on just like embracing general knowledge. But one of the things that's different about a local paper compared to all of these other kinds of media, really, more targeted types of media, even like following individual journalists on social media platforms, right, is that you're exposed to additional information simply by reading through the newspaper. Like, even if what you were looking for was like sports scores or movie theater times, you come across additional information regardless, right? In a way that you probably don't if you just go to someone's Twitter feed or you just look up sports scores on Google. So in addition to all of the discussion we've just had about, how we got here, what are some of the consequences of this decline in local news? We've alluded to them a little bit throughout the discussion, but maybe you could give us a little bit more specific detail, maybe from your dissertation research that I know I've read several drafts of, but not sure which one we're on at this point.
Yeah, no worries.
Iterative process, gang.
Yes, iterative process indeed. But what are some of the impacts you found through all of these iterations on your dissertation research?
Yeah, I'll sort of put them in like three different buckets. So I think bucket number one would be knowledge and participation, right? People, as local news declines, people know less about local politics in particular. They don't, they know less about who their mayor is, where's the city council meeting. And then I think, even beyond city politics, like even your House member or your state legislative representatives, those people could be seen as local and might be covered in your local newspaper. And so I think knowledge across all those offices is declining. And then subsequently, people are less likely to, vote in local elections and turn out in local meetings and things like that. Especially thinking about like off-cycle local elections where, you really are just voting for the mayor or the city council. We've seen some pretty big drops. I think the second bucket that I would say would be polarization. And I think polarization in a number of different ways. As people increasingly read national news, that frames things around, ideological conflict and uses national figures that are polarizing, like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. People are going to increasingly be ideologically polarized, and then also, effective in social polarization too, right? As people, engage more with strangers on the internet than they do with their neighbors about local news, that's maybe going to decrease their ability to, tolerate dissenting views and to, want to live nearby people that have differing views. And, all of that is just going to feed into the already growing divide between Democrats and Republicans that we all know.
It would seem that would also give you a distorted view of what your out-partisans believe. If I'm looking at the national news and I'm judging Republicans by what Tommy Tuberville says and not what the local Republican candidate for elected office says, that person has an incentive to moderate in a fairly liberal area like where I live and is probably not going to agree with Tommy Tuberville on everything. But I'm not seeing that. I'm just seeing what he thinks and not what she thinks here.
Yeah, and candidate quality, right? Like if your local Republican candidate is a psycho, but you like the Republican Party as a whole, you might still vote for that candidate even if the person is not very qualified. And so I think
and if you don't know that person is crazy because you haven't seen reporting on them, right? I want to pick up on this line of thinking just a little bit before we go on to. I think we didn't get to the third.
Bucket.
We didn't get to the third bucket, but I do want to pick up on this line of thinking just a little bit, because I've read some research recently as I'm working on my dissertation prospectus about how local and national politics just fundamentally are framed in different ways. There's a couple of papers in particular from the last couple of years that find that national politics is way more likely, like an order of magnitude more likely, to be framed in sort of moralistic terms, whereas local politics is almost never talked about that way, because how do you really frame the construction of a park, or sort of the esoteric more banal stuff you talk about in local politics as being this fundamentally moral thing. And that moral language, is extraordinarily more given to, allowing people to express sort of aggressive behavior and aggressive policy beliefs, right? And so I think the fact that you're getting more of that specifically in an environment that is given to affective polarization in the first place, and then is described in these terms that are given more to negativity and to aggression, that makes super clear sense to me, how the decline of local news would directly influence that kind of polarization in the mass public.
Yeah, and I'd say even on the flip, right? As people consume more national news, they're going to be more polarized, but also as people consume less local news, that could have a similar effect. There was a really interesting experiment. It was like a natural experiment where a local newspaper in the Palm Springs, the Desert Sun, decided that for the summer, they weren't going to publish any national content at all. And they just said only local content. And some researchers went into the field and did a survey. And what they found was that effective polarization decreased among newspaper readers, and that people felt less far apart between Democrats and Republicans. And I think what that showed is that not only can national news drive polarization, but local news could potentially slow it by emphasizing things like, practical governance over elite conflict or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially since so much more of local politics is actual practical governance and just like the nuts and bolts of how the government functions, right? Like Megan and I frequently talk about sort of like state capacity and all that kinds of things, and like all of the things that you don't see behind the scenes that like make life work on a regular basis, street lighting, trash pickup, municipal waste like treatment and all of that. Most of that stuff is done. Most public service provision is done at the local level. And so not having the information about that not only makes you less aware that all of these things are being done by the state, sort of the state broadly constructed, but then also sort of less likely to understand that the state is working, right? In large measure. You only notice the things that go wrong because those are now the only things that get reported on.
Yeah.
And only the noticeable things are, like surface level noticeable things are what you're noticing. If you don't have an investigative reporter who can go down to City Hall and spend the time digging through records or whatever, you aren't going to have the ability as a citizen to hold people accountable using that journalism as an oversight mechanism, basically.
Yeah, that's actually bucket number 3. So I could
Hey!
it's a perfect transition. Yeah, so bucket number 3 is accountability. And I think like that's, in some ways, that one's actually probably the hardest to measure because accountability isn't, there are sort of measures of representation that, we all know about since our professors were the ones that, or one of our professors is the ones that developed it. But, it's somewhat hard to measure accountability, but we have found things like, more corruption in places that have weaker local news ecosystems, fewer candidates emerge for office. So there's just less competition in elections, which I guess, is related to accountability. And so I think there's definitely more work to be done, probably the most work to be done in that particular area. But I think that it's, the work that I do in my research just kind of looks at, are there words like mayor or city council being written in local newspapers and what numbers are they being written about? But I think further work should definitely look into things like how much investigative journalism is still happening in local newspapers, right? Newspapers historically have been the ones that uncovered government scandals, right? The Wall Street Journal uncovered the Watergate scandal, and the Teapot Dome scandal was uncovered by the Albuquerque Journal. And so like, I think local newspapers have this great history and legacy of uncovering scandal. But I think if that is costly and that's expensive and it requires a dedicated staff that knows the city. And I think if those things are disappearing, not only are scandals not going to be uncovered, but we're never going to know that scandals aren't uncovered because we'll never know about the scandal to begin with, right? And so it's like maybe that's almost another death spiral in of itself.
It's unmeasurable. You're not going to be able to figure out what you've missed at that point. And that brought me to something that I was thinking about doing the prep for this episode, that there is a really strong value in kind of an iterative process of journalism where you have the same people interacting over and over and over again. It creates almost a certain amount of trust. And I want to be careful to distinguish this from access journalism, where you're just buddying up to people. But if you are interacting with the same elected officials over and over again, there is almost I think it's an incentive to be honest and to be as transparent as you can and to not straight up lie, maybe spin it a little bit, but not actually lie. And it also creates that basis of knowledge where you are going to know who to talk to, know where to go find things, have sources that you can go to on a regular basis that you just don't get when someone comes parachuting in from a national outlet. And I'll just as something that happened, I think last year, a story about how, I'm in Oregon, the Republican candidate for governor was running neck and neck with the Democratic candidate for governor. And you get national outlets coming into the state saying, oh my God, are Democrats in trouble? It's a very weird and very particular situation in this state, and that context is necessary to understand why this isn't a national story. This is a story in one state. And if you aren't covering those politics year in and year out, you don't know that. You're not well equipped to use the state as an example.
I also think to bring it back to the bit that you said about like an incentive not to just like totally lie and all of that. Like if you know that that reporter is going to be around next year, if you know that they're going to be around 2 years, 3 years, a decade from now, or at least that the paper is going to be around, right? And like you're a member of the city council, or you're some appointed member of a certain like local body, or maybe you're just like the city manager, right? Like you're a civil servant, right? You're not going to be able to, in the same way that you might just be able to like, you know, string along a national reporter who parachutes into a town for a little while. Like a local reporter is going to stay on that story, or even if it's not specifically that story, they're going to stay on you, right?
Yes,
Like
you've lost credibility with that reporter if you're lying to that reporter and that reporter continues to cover you. It's a terrible idea. The incentives are so bad.
And I think that like another good example of sort of this like investigative journalism going by the wayside a little bit is, I'm pretty sure that I remember reading this. Maybe Sean, you'll know if I'm just totally making this up. But the Spotlight team that was responsible for uncovering the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church has since been either downsized or eliminated entirely by the Boston Globe. Not sure if I've gotten that right. Megan, maybe you can like
quick Google here,
Google, right? And, you know, maybe we'll talk about this later, but the Boston Globe has also gone through some notable ownership changes as of late, and I don't know how much that's related, but certainly, you know, thinking about the editorial slants of news, it does raise questions about the commitment of owners to keeping those types of costly but important things going, like investigative journalism.
Yeah, and I think to bring it out, like sort of to a more abstract level, like the fact that even like the Boston Globe, a paper in a major metro area of like one of, you know, the largest cities in the country, not, you know, top 5 or anything, but roughly like 700,000 people, I think, in the city of Boston proper, that paper is going through, you know, like all of these changes and having, you know, profitability struggles and all of that. Basically, the only paper that's like really weathered this storm in any significant way is the New York Times. And that's because they're basically a gaming platform with a newspaper on the side nowadays, right?
Well, and nationalization actually explicitly helps them, right? Like their local newspapers are hurt by nationalization, but the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are all, you know, screaming and cheering because it's their national reach is allowing them to get way more subscribers than they really were able to before, right? If your only area that you can get subscribers is New York City, you can get a lot of subscribers. A lot of people live there, but you're not going to get up to 300 and whatever million people live in the entire country. And so I think, you know, nationalization has actually helped those papers, but those are small select.
Yeah, and I think I remember reading some statistic, you know, long about a year ago now or something, that like 1 in every like 100 journalists or something in the country is employed by the New York Times. It's like an insane fraction of the overall number of journalists in the country are just employed by the New York Times. So yeah, like it definitely makes sense that sort of the nationalization of politics and the nationalization of news coverage would be helping those people while everyone else is sort of, you know, going around for the rest of the scraps of the you know, 20% of the revenue that they had just, you know, 20 years ago. Yeah. Megan, do you have an answer for us? Did I make it up, or?
I think you made it up. They have a new managing editor.
Okay, well,
maybe it was a different investigative team, but I'm not finding anything for the Boston Globe.
All right. So. Well, I'm sorry for making that up for everyone. I'm doing misinformation here.
Yeah, exactly. But let's as we kind of wrap up the "how did we get here" portion of the show, does this match up with other trends that we see in society? It kind of seems like we're seeing the downfall of gatekeepers, the downfall of elites, and losing a major source of information, or a information source that people perceive to be neutral, seems like it might contribute to that. Is that causal? Is it an effect? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think it does match up with some of the trends. So I would say that, like, one thing that's interesting about local news is it actually is still pretty trusted, even amongst Republicans who have, you know, it's not great. The numbers aren't great, but it's certainly way more trusted amongst Republicans than they trust, you know, national news outlets or other types of news. And so I think, you know, there are some people that still trust local news, and I think there's still a lot of respect for the work that local news outlets do. But I do think that, one of the trends that it does sort of fit in that you were sort of indicating is this general disengagement with like professional, like, and I don't want to say professionalism in like a norm, like not in like a, you're unprofessional, more in like I'm a job, this is my job, right? I'm a journalist, I work for a newspaper, this is my profession, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I think as people get less news from those people and they increasingly get news from someone who's say, I'm an influencer and I like to make workout videos and I occasionally talk about politics, you're going to get really different kinds of information. And I think, I don't know how much that it syncs up with the sort of distrust of elites, but I think it does, maybe the general distrust of institutions, right? The idea that people are increasingly looking to the internet or social media for their information and less to these trusted institutions that have developed over long periods of time. And I think it's fair to critique newspapers. They've certainly gotten things wrong in the past and have had major misses. But I think, to suggest that the influencer is going to do a better job is probably kind of unfounded.
Yeah, there's definitely a degree of like, journalists, even if they have gotten things wrong in the past and like there are, some unscrupulous people out there, there is like a strong culture of journalistic ethics, I think, broadly speaking, in the profession, right? Like you want to make sure that you're sourcing things properly. You want to make sure that you have things confirmed by multiple sources before you print it so that people aren't, just like totally like ginning up fake news in order to sell papers, that kind of thing.
Brian Williams of NBC is one of the few people who actually suffered professional consequences for lying about the Iraq War. Just a quick reminder.
The New York Times a little bit too. People were really mad at the New York Times.
It's the journalists. Yeah. It's none of the politicians.
Yeah, it's not Bush's fault. It's the New York Times. Yeah.
And I think to sort of wrap up this first half of the episode here, like, the people are gravitating towards these other sorts of news sources in quotes in a lot of ways, because it feels good. Right. As Megan and I have talked about in the past, like this is a more like efficient product for people. There's a lot of like modern life that is more efficient in that like the market is more effectively provisioning people with what they want.
But it turns out that was a load-bearing inefficiency.
But it turns out that it was a load-bearing inefficiency. And I think local news is absolutely one of these things. Where like, yes, maybe it was inefficient to have multiple different papers across the country each independently report on national stories and local stories at the same time, right? Maybe there are economies of scale and efficiencies to corporate owners being able to produce more stories at a cheaper price point, right? And all of that. But those stories are of lower quality, and the inefficiencies that we had were load-bearing for people's understanding of local politics, for their knowledge about the world in their own confines, for their like psychological and affective attachments or lack thereof to members of the opposite party. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about some possible solutions for how we can arrest this decline in local coverage and local news and help people know a little bit more about what's going on in their neighborhood as opposed to what's going on just in Washington and New York.
Welcome back, everyone. When we left you, we were discussing how the decline in local news has kind of ruined everything, but maybe not as much as we thought. Is that a good summary of Sean's research? We're discussing how the decline in local news may not be as bad as we thought, but it certainly has led to significant consequences, particularly in local government. So we probably want to try to fix this, right, guys?
We probably want to do something at least to try to solve this problem. Now, I've had an idea that I've sort of been kicking around since like high school, which is...
You're just telling us now?
When we have our best ideas, you just got to percolate on them for like a decade. It's fine.
Well, I just, I don't know that this is a good idea, so I'm asking the expert on the subject, or at least the expert on the subject that I know and can get on my podcast. But this is an idea that's sort of like a a national endowment for the press, if you will. We have things like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which helps fund things like NPR and PBS. But I think, expanding that to something that's more specific to local news and local print news might be helpful here, at least sort of in my view of this. If we think that one of the key reasons why local news has had all of these problems is because it's less profitable than it used to be, because the profit motive pushes readers and therefore, the papers that they read towards national coverage, then providing funding through some sort of national endowment so that newspapers don't have to worry so much about profit might help them produce more locally focused content, which is their ostensible raison d'etre in the first place. So I'm going to leave it there. That's the broad contours of this idea. Do we think that this is a terrible plan, or do we think that this might have something worthwhile in it?
Concerns, but I'll let Sean go first.
Yeah, I like the idea of helping newspapers, helping the for-profits, right? Give them more money to be able to undertake the type of reporting that they maybe did 20 years ago, but aren't able to afford anymore today. That being said, a national endowment, I think there's a couple things to worry about for that. And I think the main one that I think strikes to me is just partisanship is going to infect it. And the local newspapers, I don't think right now are seen by really anyone as explicitly partisan to one side or another. I don't think if you ask someone in the street, right, are local newspapers on average slated towards Dems or reps, I don't know they would give you a systemic answer to that. But I imagine a future in which that could happen, right? People say, actually, local news is a product of the liberal elites, and that's why they created this big pot of money at the federal government, and they're just trying to brainwash everyone. And I think that type of rhetoric and that type of, if the conversation around local news becomes that, I would be way more worried than I am today about the future of local news. And so I think if there are going to be ways to help local newspapers survive via money, to me, that maybe would better come from something like tax credits or, subsidies or some other kind of way to, give them a little bit of money on the margins rather than here's a giant pot of grant money from the federal government, because I just can imagine partisanship infecting that in a way that it's infected a lot of other places in which the federal government directly gives money.
Yeah, this was maybe a better idea when I came up with it in 2014.
I think this is a product of its time. Yeah, no, my immediate assumption there is in a time when the Kennedy Center honors are subject to politicization, my concern, Sean, it would actually be going the other direction, that money then gets distributed almost as an in-kind contribution to candidates of one party or another to say, okay, local paper, please investigate this candidate for Senate or something. That would be my concern with that idea. Yeah, Clayton, I think this was a much better idea in 2014 than maybe it is now. Who knows? Maybe we'll swing back around and it'll be a good idea again in another 10 years.
All right. So what I'm hearing is that the problem is Republicans. That's the problem.
Not your idea.
Not my idea.
In fairness, James Madison also did not anticipate people behaving like this, so you are in good company.
Yeah, well, I mean,
he thought localism would dominate. So
yeah, although the founding fathers didn't really see political parties coming at all, despite the fact that by the end of their lives they were all at the heads of political parties. Okay, well, so maybe that doesn't. Maybe that doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't work.
I do like the idea of some sort of granting organization like ProPublica handing out money to local papers, or are you guys familiar with Arnold Ventures, which is a private grant making basically organization to academics to conduct studies or other organizations to conduct studies. I have less of a problem with a more individualized, here's an investigative story we're working on, can we get a grant to chase this down type model than I do with a billionaire owning one paper, because we've seen how badly that goes in the Washington Post, a national paper, and also the LA Times. Their politics and their business incentives do wind up bleeding into the news gathering organization, or at least the editorial board.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Like when people ask me about my research around investment firms, sometimes they ask me, is Jeff Bezos an investment firm or is, Patrick Shin-Sung an investment firm? And the answer in my paper is no. I don't consider them investment firms. And in part, it's funny, like it speaks to what you're saying about like when investment firms come in, I think our concern is that they're going to strip away reporters and things to try and make more profit. Billionaires don't seem to have that same incentive, right? They're already billionaires. They have a lot of money. And that's not to say they don't want more money, but I don't think they generally buy newspapers because they're like, oh, this is a way I can make more money. They buy them because now some of them maybe buy them for philanthropic reasons. Like I want to support this newspaper. I think there are real, evidences of that happening. But I think to your point, that there are also are some times where they come in and say, I want to affect the editorial slant of this newspaper. There was a funny example of I forget the billionaire's name, but the Las Vegas Review Journal.
Steve Wen.
Yes.
Or was it the Adelsons?
I forget the name now, but anyway, in 2015,
right.
a billionaire bought that newspaper mainly because it was really critical of he was a casino owner, and he was really critical of his practices, and so he bought the newspaper and then like shut all that editorial slant down. And so I think like that was a very transparent moment of like, ooh, this is, there are some bad outcomes that are associated with billionaires, even if sometimes they also pump in some money for, investigative journalism or whatever else they might do.
It was the Adelsons. I hate that there are so many billionaires in Vegas that I'm like, which one was it?
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of billionaires buying newspapers too. Like that's
which casino magnate was it? Yeah.
Yeah. The Las Vegas Sands Corporation, apparently. So
I guess so maybe this idea of like trying to provide some sort of like pot of money for local news to stop them from going under. We're in too partisan a moment for that, maybe. Check back in 2035 to see how that idea is going.
Yeah, we'll definitely be less partisan by then.
But are there some policy levers that we might be able to pull here? Like as we talked about, sort of tax credit idea.
That's totally doable.
Or like if the subsidies don't come from this sort of like national endowment for the press, do we think that this is like a state by state sort of thing that we can do? I guess the main question that I have is sort of like, if money broadly is the problem, right? Where does the money come from, and how can we address that money problem without also giving the money to people who are able to like direct it to their nefarious ends, basically?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think like, so, scholars, one area that scholars have kind of looked at is demand, right? Are there ways that we can increase demand for local news, and then hopefully news outlets on their own can make more money by, having more subscribers and charging more for advertising? And there's been a number of studies, some have tried to give people local news for free. Some have given them local news with different like messages, like support your local newspaper, or local news is important to democracy. Some have tried looking at like local elections or staying at local events to see if those types of things increase demand. And across the board, it's all pretty null. There's just about nothing that scholars have found that increases demand for local news. And I think that that's not to say that there aren't people out there that want local news. It's just really hard to convince the ones that don't already want it to go and want it. And so I think that demand has fallen short. Thinking about government intervention, like tax credits and things like that, I think that's really promising. And I think that's, I think do have a vested interest in wanting there to be some kind of local news ecosystem. I think there's ways in which it serves incumbents to have local news reporting on what they're doing. And so I think that, that's a little bit of an icky thing to think about, right? Like, does it actually serve them or not? But I think that governments doing things like tax credits, and that has been happening. I think Illinois passed a Local Journalism Sustainability Act. There's been one introduced in the U.S. House for the past like 10 years or so. Senator Cantwell from Washington has been a good advocate of that. I think a lot of those haven't gone anywhere, but maybe they could in the future. Actually, in California right now, there's an interesting one being debated about potentially doing a public notice when an investment firm comes in and buys a newspaper. And they actually asked me to comment on it, which was kind of funny. It was cool. And I think it's a great idea. So I think like those types of interventions, I think could be good. I think the last thing I would say is nonprofits are maybe I'll sort of loop academia into that, which is that nonprofits, there are a lot of nonprofits out there that have a lot of money and are actively putting money into this problem. The American Journalism Project is a big nonprofit that does a lot of support for local news. They last year announced $50 million to newsrooms to help them integrate AI into their workflows to hopefully reduce some of the burden on journalists. And so I think like interventions like that and like money coming from nonprofits or solutions coming from academia, I think to me are probably the most promising because those come with the fewest strings attached, at least I hope. The government intervention I think is good, but maybe there's a little bit of concern that the government is only going to intervene when it perceives it as beneficial to them.
Mhm.
And then I think the demand stuff just seems like there's just, and maybe scholars will come up with something in the future, but so far everything has fallen pretty flat.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more disheartening papers that I've ever read is, I think it's Dan Hopkins, has a paper, the paper that you mentioned, where like they're trying to give people local news for free. Like, what he wanted to do with that paper was give people a free subscription to local newspapers and then see how it impacted their like knowledge and all of that. But he couldn't get enough people to agree to receive the subscription in order to
Yeah.
actually do the analysis that he wanted. And so he ended up writing this paper about like nobody wants local news. And I was like, damn, that's terrifying. Like, that's so sad.
Yeah. There's another scholar from Duke named Andrew Chexler who did a similar paper looking at digital subscription. So like I didn't give them a choice, right? I'm just going to give you a digital subscription, and then he surveyed them to see like what happened, and it was the same thing. People didn't. He didn't find that people read the newspaper more often or knew anything more about government. And so I think that was, even when it's like forced on you, people still don't use it.
That might explain. Maybe I was being maybe I was part of one of these treatment groups, because I suddenly started getting local news from like a newspaper in Fresno, and like I've just never opened one of these emails. I'm like, what is this? Who put my email into this listserv? Maybe it was one of these scholars who's like, can we get people to read local news? And I'm just proving the point.
Honestly, like for some reason, I don't know why I get the Oregonian email every day that says, here are our headlines for the day. I read the headlines and I don't subscribe to the paper, so I probably wouldn't be able to click through on most of the links. But even just exposing people to headlines might be helpful at just a minimal amount of information. Maybe that makes life better. But yeah, I don't know how you create a demand if that demand doesn't exist, other than, and then I don't know how to do this, because how would you communicate this information? I don't think people have a good idea of what level of government affects different parts of their lives.
Yeah.
Because if you were to ask almost anybody, in probably the Portland area, what is the thing that is most concerning to you right now? Most people are going to say homelessness. And what level of government will resolve that for you? It's the city level, coupled with the Supreme Court. And it's entirely a local problem, but they're finding, I just read a paper. See, I did read local news. I read a story that said, the money that has been appropriated isn't being spent basically to address the solution because they don't have an efficient enough way to distribute the funding, I think. And you're never going to get that in a national paper. No one's ever, even if you are seeking out national news, no one's going to discuss that. It's a hyper local issue to the city. But you would never see that addressed either by a national media source or by people who are only concerning themselves with national politics.
Yeah, and I think not only do people not fully understand that local governments and city and county governments are the ones that do touch your daily lives way more so than what goes on in the national government or in state governments. I think sort of furthermore, people don't pay a lot of attention to those types of governments when there's even when there's an election coming up. Maybe there's a little bit more attention given to those, but people don't pay very much attention, during the regular year or when there's no election coming up. And I think, with that, that's just going to mean that people aren't routinely getting information about local politics. And so when they go to the polls to vote for local candidates or to vote on local issues, they maybe are just getting the past 2 weeks of news, the past 3 weeks of news, if that's when they've started, paying attention or started engaging. And I think that type of attention is not conducive to, really difficult questions and issues to solve, like homelessness, right? That comes from, if you're going to try and solve homelessness, you need to have people on the ground that are, actively looking at the problem and thinking about it. And you need to have people proposing innovative solutions. And I think if people are just going to get mad about stuff right when there's an election coming, or when they occasionally, when the local news occasionally breaks through to their ecosystem, that's not going to produce the kinds of solutions that people really probably want.
It probably creates more protest voting too, a certain sense of the vibes are bad and I don't know to whom to attribute my particular problem. I know who the incumbent is and that's all. So I'm going to turf that person out, whether the particular problem creating my bad vibes is attributable to them or not.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a degree here to which, like, there's a like self-reinforcing cycle here, another death spiral, right? Where like people aren't interested in local news, and so they don't get information about local politics, and so they either don't vote or they vote ineffectively in local politics. Local government works less well because there's less accountability. And so they, again, like turn off further, right? Of like, there's nothing worth learning about here. Everything's just corrupt and it doesn't work, and there's no point in paying any attention. So it's like
year-round canvassing to get information to people. Like, you need to go knock on somebody's door. Like, I know you don't read the paper, but let me tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
Having friends also would do that. Back to our overarching theme, get outside and make more friends.
It just seems like there's it feels like somewhat of an impossible problem, right? Like, if people just don't want to read local news, then there's really very little that you can do to get them to read local news, right? Like, my thought process on this is like, I don't know whether, especially with the current Supreme Court, or even regularly with any court, realistically, whether this would fly. But bringing back something like the fairness doctrine, but for local news, where it's like, you used to have to like offer equal time. You used to not be able to have this like partisan media. Perhaps there's an intervention here where, if you are like running news coverage, right? Like, you have to devote a certain amount of it to local stories, to local issues, right? And in that way, we can bring back the quote unquote inefficiency of people learning about local news, just like while they are trying to learn about something else, right? I don't really know how you'd implement that. I don't know whether it would fly constitutionally to be like, you have to report on local affairs. But it seems like that's kind of a way, like, if nobody is interested in local news and you can't get people to actively seek it out, then you have to like sort of force them to accidentally encounter it, right?
Yeah.
While they're seeking national news.
And I think like, media regulation certainly is another avenue of a way to try and solve this problem. I think like two things to say on that. Like, the first is that, could you mandate, just like how the fairness doctrine once mandated that people, treat both sides of an issue fairly, could you also mandate that news outlets devote time to local issues? I think you definitely could, but I think one challenge of that,
licensing? Yeah,
I think you could, but I think a challenge of that would be, if so many people are watching national news outlets, like, what even is local reporting if you're a national news outlet, right? If your audience is scattered across the 50 states.
Yeah, if you're CNN, right? Like,
no.
Is your local news Atlanta? Like,
this is totally a thing for like, if you guys watch the Today Show or something, and here's what's going on in your neck of the woods, and you kick it to a local affiliate for 5 minutes, and they give you that package. So we actually do have a solution for this.
Yeah,
well, I think that
I like that.
But this is, the main broadcast networks, right? Like, that's like ABC, CBS, and NBC, right? Which are still quite watched, right? But like, it doesn't, I think, solve the problem of like, cable news or like online news providers not devoting any amount of coverage to this, right?
That's true.
Like, I don't know. The way that I think about this is like, yes, there is this kind of, and I don't watch much broadcast news, so this is why like I didn't even think to bring up the like, here's your local
network,
here's your local affiliate, right? But like, I'm not a big like social engineering, social control kind of guy, and so I'm uncomfortable with this proposal. But like, you kind of got to like force people to see a little bit of local news at some point, right? Like, because even with the experience that you're talking about, right? Like where they throw it to the local affiliate, right? you can step away from the TV, you can mute it, right? Like you can take that time to like go do your makeup or like go make breakfast or something, right? Like
you can't. What are you gonna like Clockwork Orange this thing? You can't like.
Oh no, man! Like I feel like there's a certain degree of like, all right, you've read your 10th national news story on like the NewYorkTimes.com today. Like
read one local story to access. That's actually funny. No more Fox News at the gym. Only local news. Also a possibility.
I'm just trying to like, because it seems like the basic takeaway that I'm having from this discussion is that it's basically impossible to get people to voluntarily look at local news if they're not already interested in it.
That's
so
true.
I'm just trying to puzzle through ways of like,
what can we do?
Getting people who would not have sought out that news to encounter it anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just seems like it's so important that even if you are not interested in this topic at all, you still inadvertently encounter it, right? Like, that just seems really important to me. And so I'm just trying to puzzle through how we might be able to do that.
Honestly, like cultural influence, you brought up Spotlight earlier. You still get really good movies about journalists doing cool stuff, and that's probably helpful.
Before every movie, they have to play a 5-minute news clip of what's going on in your neck of the woods. Like,
I don't know.
Game. Yeah, I mean, I think like it's, like it is tough, right? Because if people don't already have that demand and scholarship doesn't really give us many answers, how can we really, quote unquote, fix this problem? And I think like just to add one more thing to that, Clayton mentioning the idea of the fairness doctrine and could we introduce regulation? The fairness doctrine was actually eliminated because it was originally applied to radio broadcasters because radio waves are public. And that was Congress thought that if you're using public radio airwaves, you should give a public service. But then cable companies came in and laid private cable lines, and then that's why Congress eliminated that rule because they were unwilling to impose those restrictions on the cable broadcasters. And when you think about the local news ecosystem today, it's a lot of that, right? It's a lot of private organizations, social media apps, and individual influencers, right? Like, are you going to force Alex Jones to do a 5-minute local news story? Are you going to say Pod Save America, you guys have to do your local news? And I think like when you start getting
to hear those,
well, it certainly would be interesting. That's the but I think like when you start getting to those. Because then you sort of ask the question, like, what even is news? Who is a news owner and who is a news producer?
Yeah.
And then who do these rules apply to? And I think that's really where this gets so difficult because regulation was easier to think about when local news outlets all looked roughly the same. But I think today there's so much fragmentation that when you think about how to regulate news, it's such a headache to think about how it applies to all these different areas and places. Especially doing something like requiring them to air local news, like they have the Alex Jones local news segment. I would love to see it, but I'm not guessing it's coming anytime soon.
I want this so badly now.
The next 5 minutes coming up with like what that would look like, right? Like he's based in Austin, right? Like that's where he is. He's based in Texas. Maybe he'd like I know this just because I follow some people who are in Austin, like some journalists who are in Austin. They're like they're doing like the first studies for like building a light rail system in Austin. I could imagine Alex Jones being like,
the light rail's gonna turn like, you gay,
or like can't do his voice, but like the real reason that they're building that light rail is so they can traffic people through Austin. They're like,
is that Alex Jones or Kermit the Frog, dude? I do not know about that one.
Kermit the Frog sounds a little bit more like this. He is Kermit.
You're right.
Kermit
you're right. That is pretty good Kermit.
This is the kind of the consolation prize for not having a good policy intervention.
Yeah, we don't have a good policy intervention, so y'all are just going to have to listen to me do impressions for the rest of the show. But no, I mean...
Yeah, I have an idea.
Okay.
Because we're out of like policy interventions. We've kind of concluded.
We've kind of concluded that there basically aren't any. Sean, you're ruining my day here.
But most of them are. Yeah,
I want to leverage... Let's talk about interpersonal relationships with people who don't consume local news and the utility of shame. If you want to tell people, did you see this story in the Oregonian? And they're like, oh, I don't read local news. I'm like, oh man, really? Okay, well, let me tell you about it. Yeah. Interpersonal manipulation, I think, may be the key here.
Make people feel embarrassed about their lack of knowledge.
Yes, if we need to create a civic virtue somehow. So we used to, and this is a national outlet, but I took a class in high school where the textbook was a weekly Newsweek subscription. And we kind of parsed out, like, it wasn't even a journalism class. It was like contemporary world affairs or something. And that was just how we were engaging. And of course, this is 2005. So there was a lot of very interesting stuff happening in the world in that year, as is true every year. But it was very useful in terms of media literacy, but also just in terms of instilling that habit of seeking out journalism. And so kind of creating a culture of news consumption at a level of educational institutions probably would be helpful, but also just interpersonally, I think, of discussing local news with your coworkers, colleagues, etc., and kind of, creating a little social pressure to get involved might be the way to go. So for our dear listeners, who I'm sure are culture leaders in their communities, let's make local news something that you want to talk about.
Were you about to say make local news great again, Megan, and thought better of it? Or
we can't make everything great again, Clayton.
I do like the idea of at least sort of like at an educational level, right? Like, as we talked about in the last episode, like bribing your kids to read, right? Like,
great idea. You should do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, creating this, as you said, culture of being interested in public affairs, right? And I think a lot of that can come through sort of education. A lot of that can come through early childhood socialization. As we all know as political scientists, political socialization is very important. If you're not interested in politics by the time that you're an adult, you're probably not going to be like that interested in politics throughout your later life. You'll get more interested in it, but the effects tail off as you get older. So that makes a fair degree of sense, even if it's more of a behavioral solution as opposed to a policy focused one.
Yeah, I like it. I do think like to, I don't know how close we are to any, but like to leave it off on one more sort of somewhat positive note.
Please do.
Well, I think like that, when people sometimes like, I think speculate a little bit, like when is this going to end, right? Like when is the decline of local news going to be over and local news can, thrive again or something?
You're going to say, when is democracy going to end? I'm like, where are we going with this?
Soon. Very soon. No, I'm just kidding. I think
when does the decline of local news end is the question.
I think my answer to that is that there's some ceiling of there's always going to be some people that want local news and some people that are willing to pay for it. And I think that local news outlets, the whole conversation we've had for the past, hour has been how local news outlets have been sort of grappling with these changes. And I think, in my mind, what if I was, to say one thing to local news outlets, and I think it's easier said than done, right? This is obviously, local news outlets are experiencing all kinds of challenges, so I'm not here to lecture them. But I think one thing I would just encourage them to do is think about the future. Don't think about just now, right? How do we survive this next month or how do we survive this next year? But think about the future and how you can find that equilibrium of like, we've hit that level of people that are always going to be subscribing to our paper, right? Like it's been that steady decline of the reluctant subscribers gradually leaving and gravitating to other media sources. But I think if you can get to the sort of baseline of this number of people or this percentage of city residents are interested in local news, and you could create a sustainable news product that way, then I think like the idea of local news demand becomes a little bit more, how can we increase people's demand, when elections are coming up or when they're really salient things for them to learn, because then that local news outlet will exist and will be able to provide that information. And I think my biggest concern is like the outlets will disappear. And then when that demand arises, right, people say, I want local news now, then there's no local news to be had. And so to me, like, I think local news outlets need to just be thinking about the future and how can we make sure that we are there when, if and when, hopefully when that demand returns, even if it's a temporary return, right? Even if it's just demand returning because something important happened in local news, that still could be helpful for a local newspaper to have people re-engage. And so I think like newspapers just need to be alive for that to happen. And so that's sort of my takeaway.
All right. Well, I guess we can leave it there on a somewhat positive note of the problem. The problem may not be solved, but at least while newspapers are alive, there is hope. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, we do not cross that threshold where the newspapers themselves cannot remain alive in some form. But until we reach that day when people are interested in local news because something has happened or because they just need the information, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And I'm Sean Ewing.
And we will see you guys next time.